Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Later on tonight, we'll watch very carefully for the ongoing negotiations in Washington. That is a domestic squabble. This evening, however, we're turning to Asia because the president is on his way outbound to two significant summits, conversations, meetings, confabs, brouhahas, meetings with the big boys in Asia. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. Gordon, the president has shortened some of his planned trips, planned visits in Asia. I believe you've indicated the Philippines and Malaysia are cut out of the president's schedule. He's going to meet with the leaders of the APEC first, and then ASEAN. Yes, ASEAN. I say all these things with Gordon's lead. This is the pivot to Asia. Is it significant, or is this an interruption right now for the squabbling in Washington?
I think it's very significant that he's cutting out his trips to Manila and to Malaysia. And the reason is that he's saying that this is because of the shutdown. Well, the important thing here is that leaders at the APEC and ASEAN forums are going to say, well, look, if you don't have the money to go to these countries, why should we talk to you now? And so I think this is a real mistake on the part of the president. It's really unfortunate. Of course he has the money to do this. He could just declare the personnel essential. It's very simple for him to do that. He won't do that. He's really, I think, undermining American credibility, not only in Asia, but around the world.
Detail here, a late-breaking story. Gordon and I are going to discuss the agendas at these two meetings in Bali and Brunei. However, what comes in from London, you can check the Daily Telegraph right now, is that there's a death in Iran. The man's name, he is now deceased, Mojtaba Ahmadi. He's identified as the head of Iran's cyber warfare program. Found in the woods outside of the town of Karaj, shot twice in the chest. Doesn't look like suicide. The significance here is that this very much is a man at the center of the offensive capabilities of Iran. Recently, the president's been in conversation with some actors in the Iranian regime, most notably the president, but there are other voices, the foreign minister, the ambassador to the United Nations, and there's talk of rapprochement, of a conversation about the suspect nuclear weapons program. I just mentioned to you because you'll see it in the news tomorrow. Mojtaba Ahmadi is dead. This is a man who led the cyber attacks on the United States, on the banks of the United States, intimidating the U.S. Navy most recently. He's left our planet. The significance here is you get to guess, spy versus spy, who is responsible. We'll move back to Asia now. Gordon, the first conference is in Bali, APEC. The significance here looks to be that a number of players are announcing their presence. You've already said they have reason to doubt the president. Under best circumstances, what is the ambition for the APEC meeting?
APEC is really going to look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is the deal that President Obama is trying to shepherd through about 10 or 11 economies in Asia. This could very well be the world's largest free trade zone if the president can put it together. And this really is the heart of the pivot. You know, we talk about the pivot as being sort of moving military assets to the Pacific, but really it is this trade deal which is going to be the centerpiece of America's efforts to essentially contain China.
The newly elected Prime Minister of Australia is announcing boldly that he's going to get to meet President Obama at the conference in Bali. Bali is the scene of two mass murder attacks by the al-Qaeda jihadists over these last decades. Tony Abbott represents the Liberals in Australia, which I've come to understand means the Conservatives. This is a government that's very bold in announcing what it's just done is reversed all of the climate change legislation policy pushed through by Labor, defeated chiefly because of climate change. Is climate change part of the conversation in Asia? Because it's been very much so in Sydney, in Australia, and every once in a while China does throw what you'd have to say is a pretzel at climate change.
Well, you know, climate change is always on the agenda somewhere. You know, it's in the communique at the bottom because they talk about everything in these communiques. But I don't think it's really going to be at the top of the discussions because right now people are going to be talking, you know, in the corridors about the durability of American leadership and our presence in Asia, because this whole thing about shutdown, but more important about the debt limit talks, is just going to rivet people both in Bali and at the next meeting at ASEAN, which is in Brunei.
I love it when Gordon says the magic word and the little bird comes down in my studio, just as it once did for Groucho Marx. The magic word was debt ceiling talks. The President of the United States, in these last hours, Gordon, giving an interview to CNBC. Why did he talk to CNBC? Because that's the way you talk to the makers of markets in the United States and in Japan, now opened, and in Singapore and on the mainland. The President of the United States, I believe the quote is that he's worried about U.S. default on its debt. Now, quite aside from the puzzlement everyone has, why being worried needs to be told to the markets, we're all worried about this. What does that mean to Asia? How would they hear that the president is worried about default of the U.S. treasuries?
They're actually going to be terrified. I mean, this would just have an effect not only in the United States and in Western Europe, but it will just roll throughout the rest of the world. Asia is already very, very tied to the U.S. You remember when Ben Bernanke in the middle of May started talking about tapering, cutting back on the quantitative easing program? That caused enormous damage in Asian markets. A talk of default by the United States is just going to put Asia on its back. And so clearly they are going to be focused on this statement.
It's not, to my knowledge, certain that the president was thinking of Asia when he made this statement, but he knows that he's outbound. So we've talked about the APEC meeting at Bali. Now, the second part of this is the 23rd Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. That will be in Brunei, which is a principality, a dukedom, kind of old-fashioned
Sultanate.
governance. Yes, Sultanate, thank you. However, here I see a headline that Aquino of the Philippines will be attending many meetings in ASEAN, including with China. There's a dispute between China and the Philippines. The president will not be visiting Manila, but the question here is, what is the Philippines' posture now with regard to China and the Scarborough Shoals and all the confrontations of this last year?
The relations are not very good because after China seized Scarborough Shoal, they weren't satisfied. So now they're going after Second Thomas Shoal and a few others. Relations have been bad. China is trying to isolate the Philippines in Brunei by now talking about this code of conduct between ASEAN and China, which would govern basically all of the South China Sea. And, essentially what Beijing is trying to do is to give Manila a hard time. This is a real problem for us because we have an obligation to defend territory that is administered by the Philippines. We didn't do it last year, and now the Chinese are just ramping up pressure throughout the rest of the South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea with regard to the Senkaku Islands.
The president's agenda is also skipping Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. That's a troubled nation, Islamic nation. I'm not quite sure, but there would be a reason to believe that by skipping them, he's saying they're less important than the other nations. Is this a problem for Malaysia? Where is it in this conflict with China?
Well, Malaysia doesn't have a territorial dispute with China except for in the South China Sea and the sea claims that Beijing maintains. Because Beijing maintains that 80% of the South China Sea, which everybody else recognizes as international water, actually is an internal Chinese lake, or so the Chinese say. Well, Malaysia has sea claims that impinge upon the Chinese claims, or really I should say it the other way around. And so essentially Malaysia is going to be very much a part of these code of conduct discussions. But, the important thing about Malaysia is that it is in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussions. We need it to stay in, and there are a lot of people in Malaysia who don't want to be a part of that. And so it's important for President Obama to go to Kuala Lumpur, but he's not doing it. And I'm really afraid that he's going to cut out of both the APEC and ASEAN meetings as well. That would be an unprecedented debacle and slap in the face of Asia.
We don't know now because the White House is adjusting its schedule on the basis of the shutdown, the continuing resolution conversations, and the debt ceiling. I know you need a scorecard at home, but the debt ceiling is always understood to be the more significant of these combats, and it won't start, seriously until the middle of the month. So you can look at the calendar and say the president has time to go there and come back for the debt ceiling. But I'm also told, and I'll talk about it later tonight, with a member of Congress who'll be here after the lengthy conversations today in the House of Representatives, Republican caucus, that the CR fight is blending into the debt ceiling conversation. One more detail, Gordon. The question of the president and Xi Jinping. What is their relationship right now? We've not seen much of the president's remarks towards China for some time.
There really hasn't been very much of a relationship after the shirt sleeve summit in the beginning of June, and that was in Southern California. And I actually think that right now there are so many disagreements between the two of them that they really haven't talked very much since early June.
Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor. We'll turn to Asia. This is The John Batchelor Show.